Hello, everyone. My name is Javad Hashmi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a PhD candidate in Islamic studies at Harvard University. My research focuses on jihad in the Qur'an, and I've argued previously in some videos that you might have seen that the Qur'an does not sanction offensive and aggressive war. You can go check out those videos. I'm not going to repeat the arguments. I'm just going to summarize and point to a couple verses here and there. But really, you should go check out those videos. In this video, what I want to do is address the sīra, or the prophetic biography. Because if I argue that the Qur'an says this, that aggressive and offensive war is never permitted, then how do we correlate this to the prophetic biography? Does that correspond or does it not, and how do we reconcile that? What I'm going to argue here is that if we use the modern historical critical method, if we're critical with our sources, then we'll see that yes, it does correspond, and that the Prophet's wars were in fact defensive in nature, or at least the Qur'an could perceive them to be defensive in nature. That's an important distinction to make. So that's how we can correlate the Quranic discourse to the Prophet's life story. And so let me just real quick just point to a few verses of the Qur'an to recap my arguments about when the Qur'an feels that war is justified. So the first thing to say is that peace is considered the default in the Qur'an, and the early believers are encouraged to spread the word of God in peaceful ways. So, for example, verse 16, 125 through 127 reads, "Invite to the path of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and reason with them in ways that are best and most gracious. And if you must retaliate, then only retaliate with the like of that which you were afflicted." So basically, we can summarize, the default is peace. Use peaceful methods, just beautiful preaching, or at most debate with them in a gracious way. And then what I argue is that war is only, or fighting is only justified for two cases in the Qur'an, and they're really connected. The first is that if you are aggressed upon, then you are able to defend yourself. So if someone fights and tries to kill you, then you're able to defend yourself and your people. But even if you do this, there is a principle of proportionality. So here we see that in that verse, and the verse is, "And if you must retaliate, then only retaliate with the like of that which you were afflicted." But even here, the Qur'an reiterates the very next sentence, "But if you endure patiently, that is better for the patient. Be patient. Your patience is only through God." So that's the first time that fighting is justified, but even then it's not the preferred option. It's only if you must do that. Otherwise, you're worried about being wiped off the face of the earth. Then you're allowed to defend yourself. Again, we see this in verse 2240, quote, "Permission to fight is given to those against whom war is being wrongfully waged." So if they fight you, then you can fight back. And then the Qur'an goes on and mentions the second time, which is connected to the first, but the second instance in which you're allowed to defend yourself, which is if you're being religiously persecuted, then you're allowed to defend yourself. So the Qur'an says, permission again to fight is given to those against whom war has been wrongfully waged, those who have been driven from their homelands against all right, for no other reason than their saying, quote, "Our Lord is God." This is why I argue that Muslims really haven't taken into consideration, or full consideration, the importance of religious freedom in the Qur'an. And this religious freedom is not just for Muslims, it's for all people, because the Qur'an is basically saying that we have free will, and that it even prohibits the Prophet from being a dictator over them and forcing them into the religion of God. So religious freedom is critical to the Quranic discourse and has been underemphasized. And so the Quran keeps going. So it says that you're allowed to fight to defend yourself and preserve this kind of religious freedom. And the Quran goes on and it says, For if God had not allowed people to defend themselves against one another, all monasteries and churches and synagogues and mosques in which God's name is abundantly extolled would surely have been destroyed, end quote. So we see that this religious freedom does not just encompass what we now consider quote unquote Muslims, but it also includes other, people of other religious faiths, anybody who worships God. All monasteries, churches, synagogues, etc. So this is a very ecumenical, open-minded view that I think we should reflect upon. Now, at no point in time does the Qur'an, so some verses do sound very belligerent if you take them out of context, but I argue, and again, you're going to have to see my previous work and videos on this, I argue that none of this ever allows for aggression. You're never allowed to launch wars of aggression. So, for example, verse 2:190 says, "Fight in God's cause against those who wage war against you, but do not aggress, for verily God does not love aggressors." Okay, and there are many other verses. I'm just summarizing my arguments. Okay, this is the Quranic evidence, at least. And finally, even if you are in a just war, you have just cause, even then the Quran prioritizes peace. So if the enemy, and this is something that Patricia Crone noticed, that even in the most, what she called, quote, blood-curdling sounding passages in the Quran, the door for forgiveness and peace and reconciliation is always left open. So for example, in verse 861, the Quran says to the believers, quote, "But if they incline to peace," that is the enemies, "if the enemy is inclined to peace, then you incline to peace and put your trust in God." That is, you put your trust in God that, even if the enemy, you're scared that they're going to backstab you, even then you should prioritize peace and just put your faith in God. So again, peace is being prioritized over war. And again, in verse 490, "If they, your enemy, if they let you be, do not make war on you and offer you peace, God does not allow you to harm them." So this completely, absolutely prohibits wars of aggression. So this is my argument from the Quranic material. And now I do argue that later medieval exegetes, pre-modern exegetes did militarize the Quran, and that it has to do with the environment in which they lived in. It was imperial times. They were surrounded by the Byzantine Empire on one side, the Sassanid, the Persian Empire on the other, and imperial war making was widely accepted. And so this was just read back into the Quran. It's not the case that the Quran was misread and now all of a sudden we're the first ones to read it right. No, it's the fact that initially, I argue it's not that they were reading the Quran and came with the wrong interpretation. It's that this was the accepted ethic at the time, which they embraced. And then later, exegetes and jurists needed to justify this. This is in later generations, and so they back projected it onto the Quran. And that's what my research focuses on. So they used some heavy-handed tools in order to accomplish this, including abrogation, where basically they just said all of these peaceful verses are abrogated or canceled out. But that's the only way they could justify it. So that's my basic argument in the as far as the Quran. But how does that track with the prophetic biography? That's the question we're answering in this video. As I said before, it used to be that Western scholars would just take the traditional sources at face value. So this is, Montgomery Watts. You would just take the traditional sources and strip out the kind of the miraculous kind of stuff, but take the rest as reliable, leading one famous scholar to say that Islam was born in, quote, the full light of history. We can know even year to year what was happening in the Prophet's lifetime. And I argue, some people think that we can know like every single battle and raid, etc. We know their names, we know exactly why they happened, etc. And that's why I was critical of that Wiki Islam page for, listing off those wars and battles as if we can take that without, we can take that uncritically, which I argue we cannot. And I'm going to hopefully put out another video in which I will deal more directly with Wiki Islam, which is honestly one of the most Islamophobic websites on the internet, and has done quite a lot of damage. But here today, what I want to do is I want to take a look at Professor Sean Anthony's work, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith. Now, it's interesting that, of course, I had a little back and forth with Professor Anthony over Twitter. I was a little perplexed by some of his comments, but he is a scholar that I respect quite deeply. And actually, I recommend his work if you want to know about how to reconstruct the historical Muhammad, which is what this video is about. I think you can do no better than his own book. And I think that if you follow his methodology, it kind of dovetails very nicely with what I am arguing. And that's why I wanted to go through his book. So Sean Anthony falls, in my opinion, in kind of that middle group between this, the revisionists and severe skeptics on the one side, who basically argue that the traditional sources are so problematic that we should just almost pretty much dump them and go to non-Islamic sources and reconstruct. And this leads to kind of radical revisionism. So that's one camp. Then the other camp is that those Western scholars who just kind of uncritically take the traditional sources and strip off the miraculous events and just take the rest at face value. That's kind of a credulous approach. And that's really out from the academy. I don't know, people do that unthinkingly, but I don't think anyone really thinks that's a justifiable approach. But Sean Anthony, I think, falls in the middle group, which is where I think we should be, which is that we can look at the traditional sources and get something out of them, but we should do so in a very critical and cautious way. And so we're going to go through his book. We're going to go through the introduction, parts in the middle, and then skip to the conclusion to just see how we can begin to construct the historical Muhammad. All right, so we're going to begin with the introduction. And I'm sorry that this video is a little bit tedious, but I do want to go through this so that you can learn something as well. And then hopefully you buy his book and give him some business. All right, so we're going to start on page 1, The Making of the Historical Muhammad. This is a book about the formation and beginnings of the sīra maghazi literature. So the biographical literature is called the sīra maghazi literature. So it's based on, it's modeled upon kind of the pre-Islamic battle days of the Arabs literature, which, by the way, is another reason, another factor I think we should keep in mind is that it's built on this idea of the pre-Islamic Arabs, like and their multiple tribal raids, and so the prophetic biography is unfortunately kind of built on that model. So we should already have a little bit of suspicion with it. All right, so he goes on. Professor Anthony goes on. An early genre, so the Sīra Maghazi literature is an early genre of Arabic writing about the life of Muhammad, the prophet and founder of Islam. All right. And he's basically, and we skip down to the bottom, he says, what we're going to do in this, to construct the historical Muhammad, is use modern historical methods and close readings of our earlier source texts. This is an approach that I agree with. And so let's see how we're going to do that. So what he argues on the next page is that there are, quote, there are 4 cardinal sources upon which all research into the historical Muhammad hinges. Number 1, the Qur'an. Number 2, epigraphic, documentary, and archaeological evidence. Number 3, contemporary and near-contemporary non-Muslim accounts, written primarily in Armenian, Greek, and Syriac. And 4, Arabic literary sources that are mostly, but not exclusively, preserved in the Sīra Maghazi literature and the Hadith compilations. All right, so the first and most important source is the Qur'an. I agree with that. The second 2 sources are kind of the non-Muslim or the secular sources, you can say. And then the fourth is those traditional Islamic sources, including the Sīra Maghazi literature and the Hadith. All right. So how does Professor Anthony kind of grade those 4 sources? He says, quote, ideally, these cardinal sources must be viewed as complementary. Of these 4 cardinal sources, the first 3 are for the most part quite early. So the 4th source, the one that's the Sīra and the Hadith, is not early, and therefore we should be a little bit more skeptical towards it. I agree with this. And this is why I was a little bit perplexed by his comments on Twitter, but all right. And he writes further. The challenges of the Sīra Maghazi tradition are particularly acute. I agree. No extant books that preserve the Sīra Maghazi traditions date from before the period stretching from the late 8th century to the early 9th. approximately 150 to 250 years after Muhammad's death. And the works that do survive are filled to varying degrees with theologically tendentious and even outright legendary materials. For this reason, a great number of modern historians have come to hold that the Sīra Maghazi literature tells us far more about the formation of the early cultural memory of Muhammad than it does about the so-called historical Muhammad. So this is why I have to ask, if this is the case, and I agree that it is, then why would we take a big, huge, long list of battles and all these details about when the raids happen? Why would we take this at face value? This is clearly material that was formulated by a later generation based on their self-understanding, which Professor Anthony very helpfully at the end of his book talks about, which has to do with their image as imperial in imperial times. We'll talk about that, and that's where ideas of Arab and Islamic triumphalism come in and then are back projected onto the early texts. All right. Let's see where we should skip to. All right. He says, secondly, the Sīra Maghazi tradition is problematic because it is such a noisy source. Its version of history tends to drown out the other sources or else demand that they be read within the framework it provides. This is very, very important, okay? He says, and we're on page 3. In other words, although the traditions may appear to be historical narratives, this current in modern scholarship holds that such traditions are in fact fundamentally exegetical rather than historical in character. Hence, the arc of this tradition's narratives is often difficult and for some impossible to unlearn. Okay, I got to repeat that. He is saying that it's so helpful because these traditions are laid out in such detail, and the tradition and that story makes sense that it's hard for scholars to unlearn this narrative. I argue that's exactly the case here when we're suddenly saying that all of these battles and raids took place. It makes total sense. That is, I think Professor Anthony should kind of heed those words that, you need to unlearn that traditional narrative. Okay. All right. Even today, quote, even today, modern scholars have scarcely begun to imagine what it would be like to read the Quran without the aid of the exegetical and chronological framework of the Sīra Maghazi tradition. And then he goes on to write about Patricia Crone and how much of a skeptic she was about the early sources. Quote, Crone calls Ibn Ishaq's, Crone calls Ibn Ishaq practically our only source, which is likely to strike specialists nowadays as rather outdated. Ibn Ishaq's corpus can no longer be regarded as the historiographical bottleneck it once was. And then he cites some other sources, and then he asks these questions. Is the problem truly as intractable as Crone characterized it 4 decades ago? Can a historian really not work with the Sīra Maghazi literature? This monograph, that is his book, has in large part been written to counter this pessimism, and demonstrate that yes, one indeed can work with this corpus, but the question of how remains. So again, he is walking a middle course, and I think it's a good course to walk, and I agree with him. So he's saying that yes, we can actually look at the Sīra Maghazi literature, but we should do very, very cautiously. All right, let's see where we should skip to now. Let's skip to page 6. So here he's going to talk about the, and I'm sure you've heard of this, it's called the Isnad cum Mutton analysis, which we can call ICMA, I-C-M-A, which is a methodology used by Western Hadith scholars to kind of date Hadiths. So can this method, can it rescue the Hadith tradition, the Hadith corpus, so that we can now rely on it as Western scholars, or secular scholars, sorry. So he talks about this at the bottom of page 6 and comes to the following 4 points. Quote, with regard to episodes from the life of Muhammad, ICMA provides the most reliable results when the number of different traditions on a given episode is high and when they are transmitted by numerous authorities. That is, when you have more data to use, you can put it into ICMA and you can get a result. Unfortunately, however, quote, many, if not most of the events recounted in the Sīra Maghazi tradition are not attested widely enough and in a sufficient number of variants to yield significant results. Uh-oh, that's bad. Second point, individual traditions vary widely in terms of wording, often due to the process of transmission and reception. Such variance resulted not only from the vagaries of oral transmission, that is, oral transmission was how these hadiths were transmitted earlier, and that results in drastic mutations. But he says that that doesn't only happen with oral transmission, but also from those of textual transmission. So again, second point is also kind of bad news. The third point, the earliest hadith and Sīra Maghazi accounts that can be reconstructed generally date from no earlier than 60 years after the death of Muhammad. And with very few exceptions, they are not eyewitness reports. Hence, the chasm between source and event is never really eliminated. It is only narrowed. Okay, so I think a great deal of suspicion is due, at least if you're using a secular approach to the sources. Now, I want to be fair. This is a video about a secular approach to the historical Muhammad. I think there's a different approach that you use as if you're a traditionalist religious believer, then you have certain religious premises, and then you're really constructing the Muhammad of faith. Here, we're talking about the Muhammad of history. Now, you might believe that they line up, but we're talking about from a Western historical methodology, how we arrive at the history of Muhammad, the historical Muhammad. That's what this video is about. All right. So he's listed 3 points so far, not good for the sources. What's the fourth point? Quote, although analysis can verify the authenticity of transmission, that teacher X transmitted tradition N to pupil Y, it cannot verify the historicity of a given tradition being transmitted. We merely get a sense of its beginnings. Okay, what is he saying there? He says, quote, an early tradition is neither necessarily a historically accurate tradition, nor even a historical one. That is to say, it doesn't necessarily go back to the prophet, and there's no reason for us to think so. So that is why the modern secular scholarship, even people who are striking this middle grounds, which is the more friendly side to the sources, is not taking this all the way back to the prophet. And I also recommend the Twitter thread by Jim. I think he's at Islamic Origins, where he has posted about Motsky and shown that even Motsky is skeptical and cautious about saying something like that. That is, that we could take these back to the prophet. All right. So he then talks about, here we're really, in the rest of the next couple pages, he's just talking about the two different camps, I believe. Basically the skeptical side and the less skeptical side, the middle ground, the cautious side that he follows, which I agree with. Let's go to page 10. I think this is a very key point. He writes, about the Sīra Maghazi tradition. These works rely on historical discourse in order to construct a sophisticated theological narrative about the past. Much of what is conventionally termed historical memory is in fact narrativized theology, and a failure to recognize it as such leads to gross historical errors. I mean, this is beautiful. This is exactly what I am arguing when it comes to the stories of the battles and wars of the prophets. That's what it is narrativized theology. It's lining up with ideas of Arab Islamic supremacy and triumphalism that were later ideas that were then back projected into the Qur'an, and then also that's how the Sīra was constructed. So it doesn't tell us about history as such. All right, is it all gloom and doom? Well, no. He writes on page 11, how then can historians escape this loop of memory's horizon? And now he's going to talk about how we can. Well, first of all, he reasserts that we have the Qur'an. I agree with this. He says, quote, the Quran is the earliest and most important artifact of the life of Muhammad. This assertion, he argues, reflects not the naive sentiments of believers or pietistic scripturalists, but rather an emerging consensus based on over a century and a half of Western scholarship and debate. That is to say, the revisionist camp that was, kind of questioning the transmission of the Quran has really been beaten back now. And we have very good reasons to rely on the Quran as our earliest extant source, which is, for the most part, very well transmitted and preserved. All right. That the text, and now I'm quoting him again, Sean Anthony, that the text of the Quran has been established as a written document mere decades after Muhammad's death was first demonstrated on the basis of the intrinsic qualities of the Quran itself. And this was first done by Fred Donner. However, the arguments for the Quran's antiquity have in recent decades been considerably strengthened by breakthroughs in the paleographic analysis of the early Arabic script and codicological and radiocarbon analysis of the earliest surviving fragments of the Quran on parchment and papyrus. All of this leads modern historians to an encouraging conclusion. The theological narrative that renders the sīra Maghazi literature such a problematic historical source has not touched the Quran, the primeval document of Islamic religiosity. That's good news, and I think the Islamophobes and anti-Muslim ideologues should be made aware of this. All right. The next page, he just kind of reinforces this point, so you can look at his book for more of that. But then he asks, page 12, so why not just jettison the Sīra Maghazi tradition and rely solely on the Quran as our main source about the historical Muhammad? Although historians can and indeed must rely on the Quran when writing on the historical Muhammad, it is an unusual historical source. The Quran relates no stories of Muhammad's life, offers no narratives of his companions or his enemies, and in general takes little interest in directly providing the immediate historical context for its own message. In fact, as I will be arguing in an article that I'm writing, it strips much of the historical details from its stories. And there's a reason why it does that, and Professor Anthony is going to point to that here. So he says, when it addresses historical material, the Quran does not so much aim to convey, to clarify, or to record historical facts as to edify and to exhort. It is emphatically an oratorical and liturgical text, not a historical one. That is to say, the Quran is meant about encouraging proper belief and really getting people to do good deeds and stay away from evil. That is why I agree with Gabriel Reynolds' conclusion that the Quran is a homiletic text, and that's how we should understand it. That it is not meant as a book of history or science. All right. Then he gives an example to drive this point home, and then he says on page 15, and again I very much agree with him. Quote, I contend that the utility and richness of the Quran as a historical source has been undersold. For one thing, the Quran can be read historically, even if one rejects the proposition that it may be mined for proof text to confirm the historicity of this or that narrative of the Sīra Maghazi tradition. No longer can the Quran, its Arabian context, and thus Muhammad himself, be seen as aloof from the political stakes and imperial machinations in the region of the Eastern Roman Empire and Sassanid Persia. And here I think Juan Cole's book is a good one to look at. All right, so basically this is the trend in recent Quranic studies to view the Quran as a late antique text and to contextualize it in its background, which I agree with. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. He's talking about how to read the Quran. And then he says this, and I think this is another very key point. The Sīra, and this is on page 17, the Sīra Maghazi tradition is a second order source. That is, the Quran is a first order source, and the Sīra Maghazi tradition is a second order source to be read in light of the Quran. And it ought not to provide, that is the Sīra Maghazi literature ought not to provide a framework for reading the Quran, because unlike the Quran, it is not an artifact of the earliest phase of Islamic religiosity, but rather a corpus that attests to the centuries-long formation of Muslim identities and ideologies. That is to say, it's full of historical anachronisms. So Professor Anthony goes on. A famous and somewhat notorious legal maxim attributed to the Syrian scholar Al-Awza'i boldly declares, quote, the tradition determines the meaning of scripture. Scripture does not determine the meaning of the tradition. That is, the sunnah rules over the Quran and not the Quran over the sunnah. This is a maxim that I have been critical in the past, and that is based on my training in the secular academy, right? I have my bachelor's, master's, and I'm in my PhD now of secular studies. I don't have, I mean, I do have some traditional Islamic learning, but I didn't get any degrees in that way. So if you're a Muslim watching this and you're getting offended, this is just my methodology, okay? Quote, Professor Anthony continues, as a historian, what I advocate is essentially the inversion of Ozai's principle, to take the historical and philological insights gained from reading the Quran to reinterpret the sīra Maghazi literature. I agree with this. Now, here's where I wanted to push back on some of Professor Anthony's indirect or unclear or cryptic tweets on Twitter. He seemed to be implying, at least from what I understand, is that as a religious believer, a Muslim is bound by the traditional historical sources. But I disagree with this. The Islamic landscape today is very dynamic and vast. There's a lot of internal diversity, and we shouldn't just flatten it out that way. Yes, there are traditionalists who would hold firm to the traditional sources, and that's perfectly fine. But there are many Muslims who are willing to and want to take the critical insights of the modern secular academy and see how they interact with religious thought. This is called Islamic academic theology. Now, it's not just the West who pioneered this. Muslim scholars are some of the first to, Muslim thinkers are the first to have what we can call this Quranic turn. And Patricia Crone, to her credit, credits Islamic scholars for this. And she says Western scholars should mimic this Quranic turn, which, by the way, is not only amongst Islamic modernists, but also amongst many Islamic traditionalists. So you'll see that there are some institutions now that have formed that are focusing heavily on the Quran, which honestly was not done in the past. Like this. So what we're witnessing amongst modern Muslims is the Quranic turn. And Patricia Crone rightfully notes that Muslims in some way pioneered this, and Western scholars are the ones who are following suit. So this idea that as a Muslim, I'm somehow bound to one approach, I think that's not a correct thing to imply. So I agree, bottom line is that I agree with this, that we should take the Quran as our guide. And that's equally valid as a religious claim or as a historical claim. In fact, the two kind of join together here. Now, of course, I don't agree with religious kind of thinking guiding our historical scholarship, but this is a question which drives the other. I think our critical historical scholarship should drive our academic theology, kind of not the other way around, but this is obviously a long debate. All right, so Professor Anthony writes on the next page, both the Quran and the Sīra Maghazi tradition must be read historically and philologically. And he says that we should draw upon methods that are text critical, codicological, rhetorical, historical, and so on. All right. Let's see. All right. I think that is, we're reaching the end of the introduction. Now, this is the part where I really liked, at the end of his introduction, so the sense that I get from Twitter is that Professor Anthony, rightfully, I mean, he may be justified in this. I think he feels uncomfortable, and many scholars do. I think many secular scholars do, is you shouldn't mix, you shouldn't blur professional lines. That is, in the academy, we only do secular scholarship. We don't do normative confessional work. We don't do theology. And this is kind of a conflict in religious studies and theology that is a long history. But the reality is that, as I've argued elsewhere, is that Jews and Christians have long been, Jewish and Christian scholars have long been doing academic theology in the halls of the academy, and in many, like there's the Faculty of Divinity in which this kind of work is done. It might be argued that in some universities this is frowned upon or should not be allowed. I don't agree with that, but that's a valid viewpoint for Professor Anthony to have. But what's interesting is that in the conclusion, in the end of his introduction, Professor Anthony is very clear that this sort of historical critical research into the historical Muhammad has, quote unquote, political ramifications that might be good. And again, I agree with him. And that's why I'm arguing that by reconstructing the historical Muhammad, we can move beyond this view of a warmongering prophet that I believe is unfortunately being put forward by Islamophobes. And they do rely upon uncritically using traditional sources to kind of paint this picture. And this sort of historical scholarship can push back against it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That is, after all, what he says in the end of his introduction. He says, quote, that such historical inquiry poses no challenges for contemporaries, whether persons of faith or not, is also a common canard. Canard? I don't know how to pronounce that. New knowledge always entails a new way of looking at the world and at humanity itself. I agree. It affects the way we view our religion. Quote, early modern humanistic research into the historical Muhammad dismantled hoary European views of him as a demoniac possessed of the demoniac. I think that's demon and maniac put together, possessed of the malevolent spirits of the age. Okay, so if it's legitimate for historical scholarship to push back against that idea of Muhammad, then why is it not justified to use the same historical scholarship to push back against the idea that the prophet was a warmongering prophet? And which is a long-held Western idea. Quote, so too, contemporary research into the historical figure of Muhammad might dismantle the paranoid, paranoiac, fear-mongering discourses that cast Muhammad, and by extension Muslims, as possessed by demons that torment our own time, such as terrorism and religious fanaticism. Okay, so Professor Anthony agrees with me. This is not a call for the politicization of scholarship on early Islam. So I think that's where his concern is. And maybe he feels that I'm doing that. And I can understand that. And that might be legitimate. He might frown upon what I'm doing. And I get that. That's okay. I'm not going to stop, but I get his critique from that standpoint. And I respect it. I just disagree. Okay. And the reason why I disagree is there's a long history of Islamophobia in the West. Western scholarship has not been independent of this, sometimes been in cahoots with this. And more importantly, I think it's just the exigencies of the time that Islamophobia is rampant and we need to push back against these ideas. And also, this kind of research pushes back against the other side of this, which is Islamic extremists. So I think this is very important work to do, and I'm not going to stop. All right, quote. So again, this is not a call for the politicization of scholarship on early Islam, but merely to recognize that not only the findings of historical research, but also its very undertaking have ramifications for our time. Unquote. I agree. Now, he concludes on this optimistic note about how much we can construct of the historical Muhammad. He quotes Patricia Crone, the late Patricia Crone. She says, quote, we probably know more about Muhammad than we do about Jesus, let alone Moses or the Buddha. And we certainly have the potential to know a great deal more, said the late Patricia Crone. If this, and then this is Professor Anthony speaking, if this monograph succeeds only convincing its readers that this optimism about the field's future is indeed justified, I will be quite satisfied with the fruits of my labor. Okay, so that's the end of the introduction. I'm going to cut this video here and we'll go to a part 2. Thank you very much.